So the title of my talk is Dialect Syntax Needs Given Attention, the Alternative Embedded Passive, and hopefully by the end of the talk you'll kind of know what that all means. Right. So most of you probably know what actives and passives are, but just a little reminder, right? Active is kind of your canonical sentence, right? So something like subject verb object, right? Lucy ate the cake, right? And then we have a passive where we're switching around the subject and the object, essentially. So we get something like the cake was eaten. We have this agent, Lucy, that's in a by phrase, it's optional. Here's Jim. And so we also have a passive morphology, right? So we have this be verb there, and then eaten, right? So this en or ed participle form. Now I said the title is the alternative embedded passive. So what do I mean by embedded? So an embedded verb is basically when we have two verbs, and one of them is kind of inside the other. So if you think about syntax, right, it's not just linear, but it's hierarchical. So one basically comes after the other. So we have Lucy wanted, and then the eat bit that's the embedded verb. So an embedded passive then would just be a passive that is embedded, right? So we have the to be, which we usually get with the passive, and our same passive morphology. So the participle form, and it's just coming after another verb. Okay, so these are all fairly standard forms. So the form I want to talk about today is what I call the alternative embedded passive. And this example is from, I think this was found in Pittsburgh. So does your car need detailed? Right, so we get this alternative embedded passive, or AEP, with need primarily. So something like my hair needs cut, right? We also see this with wants, so the cat wants fed, and sometimes with like as well. The baby likes cuddled, right? And those are pretty much the main verbs, these three verbs that we get this AEP with. Now, in terms of the geographic distribution of this feature, it's especially known in American English to be a feature of what's called Pittsburghese. Right? So the language that people use in Pittsburgh, it has various features that are fairly unique to Pittsburgh. As you can see from this map, this is from the Yale Grammatical Diversity Project, and they surveyed people, and not all of the points are in Pittsburgh or even in Pennsylvania. But that's kind of the epicenter where you find it. So this is a close-up of the same map of Western Pennsylvania. So you can see Pittsburgh over there. There are several points kind of all on top of each other. There's another little cluster over there. So Western Pennsylvania seems to be where you definitely get this, at least in American English. Now, you also get this in Scottish English, which many of you may be aware of. Some of you may even use the AEP. So the Yale project, they were mostly concentrating on American English. So they have about 4 data points for Scotland. So it's not very comprehensive. And in fact, I've been kind of looking out for these, and I see these in various places. So over the summer, I was near Inverness, and I saw this poster that had been made by a child. And just to zoom in, it says, the Lovat Scouts War Memorial needs renovated. Right? So this is another data point over there near Inverness. And in fact, I was recently reading this book. It's a novel by Jenny Fagan, who's an Edinburgh writer. And in the book, which has various Scots or Scottish English forms, one of the characters says, this bus needs serviced. Right, so if you look around for this here, and really I think all over Scotland, you will encounter these, and you hear people saying them as well. So there's been some sociolinguistic research on this construction, and in particular, there was a series of 3 papers, so in 1996, 99, and 2001, by some American researchers, and they looked at the AEP with these 3 verbs, and they essentially did a paper for each of these verbs. And what they found was an implicational scale of use with this. So they found that the most speakers use the AEP with the verb need, right? There were fewer speakers who used it with want, and there were even fewer speakers who used it with like. So not only were there these numbers, so smaller groups, but there was also this implicational scale in the sense that if you were a speaker who could do the AEP with like, it also meant that you could do it with want and need, right? If you were someone who could do it with want, it didn't necessarily mean you could do it with like, but it meant that you could do it with need, right? So need is the most frequently used, like is least frequently used, and we get this scale. So when I was initially studying this, I asked some Scottish speakers, and I only originally had 6 people, right? So not a very large number of people. But I got some initial findings that seemed to match up with this. So I asked them things like, can you say, my bicycle needs fixed, or the cat wants fed, or the kitten likes cuddled, right? And so these are all different speakers. So going from the one person who said, yes, I can say all of these, right? We had some people who were either a bit unsure or said they couldn't say some of them, and some people who were unsure about all of them. But generally this matched up with this finding by Murray and colleagues. There was kind of a problem with this survey because originally I just asked the speakers, can you say this? Or can you not say this? Or is it something that maybe you can't say, but you've heard other people say, right? So we had a kind of yes, no, maybe. And so this was okay, but also there was definitely an effect of people saying, well, I wouldn't say this because I know it's wrong, right? So people having a bit of linguistic insecurity about this. And that's something that I kind of tried to deal with in further study of this. I did also consider some of these other verbs. So, could you say the kitten loves cuddled or hates cuddled or whatever? But I didn't get very robust data on that. And that doesn't seem to be very widely used if these other verbs are used at all. So I'm still just concentrating on need, want, and like. So this AEP, it looks quite similar to a number of other constructions. So most obviously the standard passive, right, where we have an embedded passive and we have a to be. This very clearly allows more main verbs, right? So we can get prefers or wishes or asks or all of these. So we're definitely not limited to needs and wants and likes. With this standard passive. But we get the to be, which we don't have in the AEP. It also looks a bit like this construction, which Edelstein and Pullum call a concealed passive. Right? So this is something that actually doesn't have passive morphology, but it behaves like a passive. So something like the cat wants feeding. So for those of you who are from a bit farther south, this might be something that you're more likely to say. So we get maybe less of this. Oh, we have another person? No. Okay. So we get less of this up here and kind of more of the AEP in Scotland. But it still looks similar. Maybe, again, allows a greater variety of main verbs. I put likes in brackets there, because if you say the cat likes feeding, it actually sounds like the cat is doing the feeding, rather than a kind of passive. So maybe possible, but maybe you get some conflict there with another meaning. Another thing this looks like is linking verb constructions, right? So we have a subject, and then we have a verb, and then we have a participle, right? Now, this participle may very well be an adjective, right? So the silver looks polished. It sounds like the silver needs polished, right? Seems very similar. So there is a question about whether the participle in the AEP is a verb or an adjective, and I'll get to that later in the talk. And also, we have this transitive construction. So this is used much more widely. So it's just like the AEP, but it has an object, right? So instead of the car needs washed, we have she needs the car washed, right? As opposed to she needs the car to be washed, right? Which we can also say. But this is something that seems to be used much more widely. So again, it looks somewhat similar to the AEP. So, as I said, there has been sociolinguistic study of this, and this is also something that people notice. So people who don't use this construction, when they move around and they meet people from other places, they notice this. And this is from an article in the Boston Globe, right? And it's somebody essentially complaining about this. And saying the words to be are eliminated from phrases on a regular basis, right? So the sink needs fixed, the lawn needs cut. We got a notice from school saying the kids' homework needs reviewed by parents, right? And there's this perception here, this idea that the to be is there, but it's just being dropped, right? So people are just not saying it kind of haphazardly, right? So this is perception from people who don't use the AEP. And this is actually something that comes up in the literature on this as well. So Murray and Simon talk about this, and they say, well, what are the origins of this? And they say, well, we think it's just an elliptical form. So you think, again, it's just people just not saying the to be bit, just dropping it. And they say these things are structurally similar, right? So the AEP and the standard embedded passive, and they function in identical ways, right? And they're syntactically and semantically interchangeable. So this is something that I'm going to disagree with. Right? I think this is not the case. One thing they also bring up is there are some speakers who use the AEP exclusively, right? So they would never use the standard form with the to be, right? So that's already a bit of a counter argument to this, right? Because that's saying they always have the standard form and then they always drop the to be, right? So that's a slightly odd thing to say. And it maybe indicates that there's something else going on. Right, are you with me so far? It's okay? Okay, good. So this idea of phonological ellipsis is basically a way of saying something that's there in the syntactic structure but is not being pronounced. So don't get too panicked about the syntax tree. But an example of this would be if we have a sentence such as, Lucy thinks that she will dance, right? So I have this tree for this, right? We have this that, which we call it a complementizer, right? And it allows us to have this subordinate clause. Now, it's possible, right, for us to say this sentence without the that. So we can say, Lucy thinks she will dance. And the standard analysis of this is that this structure is still all there, right? That complementizer position, the that position is still there, but we're just not saying the that, right? And there's a reason that we analyze it this way. Specifically, we have this verb think, right? And think, among other things, can have this subordinate clause after it with the that. And we have lots of verbs that can do that. So know or say or various other verbs, right, can have this kind of subordinate clause, this kind of structure. And with all of these verbs, we can say them with or without the that, right? So we can say, she knows that, blah, 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 or she knows, blah, 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 right? In every case. So, our alternative explanation to this, we could say, okay, so actually the structure is not there, right? So we have the things, right? And in some cases, we have this structure. In other cases, we have this structure, right? Which is the same structure, but we've got rid of the complementizer and the complementizer phrase. The reason we don't like this analysis, so it's wrong, is because if we had it that way, we would be saying that for all of these verbs, right, they can all have these two different kinds of subordinate clause. So they can all have the one with the structure that has the that, and the one with the structure that doesn't have the that. So given that it's universal, right, that you can have the that or not, it makes sense to say, instead of saying sometimes it has one structure and sometimes it has the other structure, it makes more sense to say, actually, it's always the same structure, and it's just something that we don't pronounce. Right? So it's something that is invisible in the syntax, or whatever the spoken form of invisible is. It's unspoken. Is that okay with everyone? Kind of, yeah. Okay.
I would have to ask what verbs are actually exclusive of omitting the that. So this form is, if this form is wrong, what would be an example of a verb that forces the that? You know what I mean?
So in English, there isn't any. Right? So the point here is that all of the verbs have both options.
Okay, so why is this option wrong again?
Right, so because, right, so we'll go back again, right. So we have this structure, and in fact, we have it with the that, right. So we have the verb think, and the verb think says, I want this thing next to me, right. I want this CP, right. We could replace the verb think with know or say or many other verbs, right. And all of them can have the that, right? And all of them can also omit the that, right? So it's easier to say that this is a property of that. Sometimes you pronounce it, sometimes you don't, right? Otherwise, we're saying this is a property of all of these verbs, right? That sometimes they have this kind of structure, and sometimes they have that kind of structure, right? Which is a strange thing to say. All of these verbs behave in exactly the same way with respect to that structure. So it's easier to say it's actually something about the that and the that being absent.
Okay.
Is that kind of cleared up?
Kind of. Still, I would argue that why have the distinction if both forms are, if there is not a single verb that excludes, the form without the that, why really bother with the distinction of adding it as a property of that, rather than just saying, okay, all those verbs that you have can have either this or that form.
Because it's easier to say we have this one word that has this property, then we have all of these different words that just happen to all have the same property.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So it's the simpler explanation.
I guess.
Okay. Right. Yeah, so we don't like that analysis. Okay, so when we have these verbs, right, that are followed by an embedded form, a to form, so non-finite to form, we traditionally in syntax actually divide these into two categories. So we call them control verbs and raising verbs, right? It doesn't matter where these names come from. But the distinction is that when you have a control verb, it is requiring a subject that has some kind of volition, right, or is sentient in some way. When we have raising verbs, they don't have that requirement, right? It might be a subject that in some way is sentient, but it's not required. So what we're saying is control verbs are imposing this requirement on their subject. Raising verbs don't impose that kind of requirement. And there's another distinction, there are various distinctions, but another relevant distinction, which is cross-linguistically, so not in English, but in a number of other languages. So I think Swedish and Hebrew and German and various other languages I can't remember. But different languages, unrelated languages in many cases, we have control verbs that allow us to have a word, so something equivalent to a that, a complementizer type thing, between the main verb and the infinitive. Right? So we have, John has tried the book to read. Right? And this is something that is found cross-linguistically. So there's an indication there that in terms of the structure, whether we can see it or hear it or not, control verbs have bigger complements than raising verbs very often. So they have, when I say bigger, they have more syntactic structure going on there, right, in the bit that follows the verb. So again, we don't get this contrast in English, but it's very well attested cross-linguistically. So when we're trying to distinguish between control and raising verbs, we can do a number of diagnostics. So one of them is using expletive subjects. An expletive subject is a dummy subject. A subject that doesn't really mean anything. It's just filling in our subject position. Right, so we do this in English. You don't have to do it in every language, but in English, yes. So something like there. There seemed to be frequent discussion. Right? We can't say there tried to be frequent discussion. Right? It doesn't work. So this is telling us that we have a raising verb and a control verb. Right? So seemed is a raising verb, try is a control verb. Right? Because try is imposing some restrictions on its subject, which our raising verb seem is not. So when we do this for our three verbs that we get in the AEP, this is what we get. So we have there needs to be frequent discussion, okay, right? Tells us need is a raising verb. Want and like don't work for this. So this is telling us that these are control verbs, right? So they're imposing some restrictions on their subjects. Another test we can do is the use of idioms. So if we have an idiom like the cat was let out of the bag, right? So, unless you want me to call the RSPCA, right, this is not an actual cat, right? So it's not an actual thing. It's part of this idiom, right? So again, we can say the cat seemed to be let out of the bag, right? So the cat is not really a thing, right? And our raising verb is not requiring it to be any kind of thing. If we say the cat tried to be let out of the bag, it's actually grammatical, but in that case, you have an actual cat in an actual bag, right? So you have a problem there. So this is telling us, again, that seem as a raising verb, try is a control verb. Right, we can do the test again. Right, cat needs to be let out of the bag. And these other readings, we only get the reading where it's an actual cat in a bag. So it's not the idiomatic reading. So again, this is telling us that need is a raising verb, want and like are control verbs. And then finally, just generally non-sentient subjects. Right? Bicycle seemed to work well, bicycle tried to work well. Right? So you might be kind of anthropomorphizing your bicycle, and then maybe that's okay. But again, we get the same distinction where seem is a raising verb, try is a control verb. Right, and if we do it for need, want, and like, we get the same answer. Right, so need is a raising verb and want and like as control verbs. Right, so need is not really imposing restrictions on its subject, whereas want and like are. So we can put them in boxes like that. Now, there are maybe some ways in which these are not entirely fitting neatly into these categories. So basically they do, but maybe there are some cases where there are shades of grey with this. So one thing is the use of want to mean need. Right? So we can't say the soup wants to cool down, but we could say the soup wants salt. Right? Maybe some speakers can say that, maybe some people can't. again, these walls want to be painted, not so good. These walls want a coat of paint. Right? Maybe kind of meaning need or lack. I looked this up in the OED. And you get sort of older meanings of want. So this is a word that has maybe changed as well. So meaning to be without, to lack, to be deficient in. And it says, this is rare now. So this is, again, maybe an older meaning. Or also, another definition, to suffer the want of, to have occasion for, need, or require. Maybe not our most frequent use of this, although we do talk about things being wanting sometimes, right? So lacking or needing. Just out of interest, the OED also talks about this form I talked about, the concealed passive, right? It wants doing, it wants to be done, it needs doing. Right? And I have this example from Alice in Wonderland. So, your hair wants cutting, said the Hatter. Right? Where it doesn't mean the hair is wanting something, it's needing something. There are also some slightly more tenuous examples of using the word like to mean tend to. Right? So again, the soup like salt, not so good. But I got these, I found these on the internet. So these are actual test examples, things that people have written. So things like, sea arrow grass likes to grow along the shoreline. Or the chain on my bicycle likes to chew up my pants. Right? So, meaning trousers, I think. So somehow anthropomorphizing a little bit. But you could get sort of a reading where it's a bit more like tend to, right? And then it's a bit more like a raising verb, possibly. But probably less so than you can with sort of wants to mean needs, and obviously less so than needs as a raising verb, which is pretty much always a raising verb. So, where am I going with this? As I said, I did this survey originally. I had 6 people from Scotland, which wasn't very many. It wasn't really enough. So I then did an internet questionnaire with 25 people, which was a much better number. And these were almost all people who had grown up in Pittsburgh. I think about 3 of them hadn't grown up there, but had lived there for a very long time. Right? So all people from Pittsburgh in one way or another. And I gave them 32 sentences. Some of them, not too many, some of them might have given up about halfway through. And I gave them these options. And I allowed them to choose more than one option. So the idea here was to get around where you get people saying, oh, I can't say this because I know it's wrong. Right? So they had the option of saying something like, I could say this and this sentence sounds wrong. They could pick as many as they wanted, basically. So this worked to some extent. Right? So I did get people picking multiple options. In some cases it was a problem because people didn't pick multiple options for everything. Right? So sometimes they would only tell me, I could say this or this sounds fine, but not both. Right? So it kind of worked, maybe needed a bit more refinement to get all of the information I wanted. And this is what I found from these Pittsburgh speakers. And these really matched all of the previous findings. So for something like the cat needs fed, 10 of them, of the 25, said, I could say this. Of those 10, 7 of them could say the baby wants picked up. And of those 7, 4 of them could say, my dog likes walked twice a day. And so again, we get this hierarchy of usage. In the interest of full disclosure, I had one person who said they couldn't say the dog likes walked. Oh no, I'm trying to think if that's right. No, I think that they could say the dog likes walked, and they could say the cat needs fed. And for the wants one, they didn't say whether they could say it or not. But they said it sounded fine. Right? So it's not really a counterexample so much as they just didn't report that they could, presumably they could say it. So this seems to match all the previous findings. when we get to, I've never heard this before, almost nobody said they'd never heard the needs or wants example. We had quite a few who hadn't heard the likes example. So again, we get this general impression that the needs form and the wants form are more frequently used than the likes form. In terms of using, in terms of using non-sentient subjects, so non-volitional subjects, as we would expect for need, this was acceptable for many people. So my bicycle needs polished, the plants don't need watered, that was fine. In terms of using non-sentient subjects for wants, we got much lower results. So I had a couple of people who said, this sounds okay. I had one person who said, I've heard this, and these were different people, so that's 3 people. But not a very high acceptance rate. However, this person who said, I've heard this, also said, this is classic Pittsburgh. Right? So I started to suspect there that maybe part of what was going on is people are thinking a lot, when I'm asking this, about what wants means, right? And what the standard use is. So that we may still be getting an effect where people are saying, I can't say this because they think it's wrong. And in fact, yes, I had a lot of people say, this sentence sounds wrong. Right? So people didn't like it. And Murray and Simon, who studied this, they made this comment when they asked people, they said this constraint, so the constraint against having something inanimate or non-sentient with want, appears to be so highly marked and so far above the level of consciousness that there's evidence for its validity even among those speakers for whom this construction is ungrammatical. Right? And people said things like, this doesn't make sense, how can a car want something? Right? Now, I think that this is not the right conclusion, right? Because they're making a judgment from the speakers who don't use the AEP. Right? So they're saying, this is so wrong that speakers who don't use the construction know that it's wrong. Right? So what they're actually finding, right, is it's wrong in standard English, right? But these speakers, they can only comment on their own use, so they don't actually know if it's something they don't use, that it's wrong in the AEP. So I think this is also not the right conclusion to get from people saying things like that. When I looked this up online, I got lots of examples of people using want in the AEP with non-sentient subjects. So all the dirty dishes want washed, the grass wants mowed, he has a face that wants slapped, right, which I particularly liked. Right, so these are all non-sentient things, subjects. We also have cases where we have sentient subjects, but it's clearly not a desire on their part, right? That doctor of hers wants reprimanded, or all kids want told off from time to time, right? So this, again, is more of a raising type of reading, right? Where it's a need reading rather than an actual wanting. Then again, excited to look for these non-sentient subjects, non-volitional subjects with like in the AEP. And actually, I didn't get anybody to say that they could say this, but I had a few people say this was something that they had heard, right? So it seems to be something that exists. Murray and Simon also have this example where they overheard somebody saying there was a particular plant and it was easy to grow, except that it likes watered every day. Right? So I think this is a case where this is more of a need reading. Right? Because they're not even, the fact that it's except, right? They're not even saying like it's good if it gets watered every day, and the plant does better. They're saying actually it has to be watered every day, right? Because otherwise it's easy to grow, but it has to be watered every day. So again, I think this is a need reading. And we know in general, right, that people are not good at reporting their own speech, especially if they think it's something that's stigmatized. And Murray and Simon talk about this, and they say they had cases where they heard people use it with like, and then they chased them down and said, take this survey, right? Because I've just, they didn't say, I've just heard you say this thing. They said, like, take this survey. And then the same people would turn around and say, absolutely not, I do not say this, right? So we have to assume that all of these things are kind of under-reporting. In terms of then our other tests for control verbs versus raising verbs, this has been done by Carol Tenney, and basically needs, as we would expect, it passes the test, right? So we have our idiomatic subject, cat needs let out of the bag, the bullet needs bitten to get through this. They sound a bit weird, but she at least got some people to accept these, and I got some people to accept these. So when I asked, again, I had a couple of people who say, yeah, I can say this, or I've heard this. And there may also be an effect of, whether people talk about keeping tabs on things. I did this with want as well. So fairly low acceptance rate, but a few people said, yeah, this is okay, or I've heard this. And then for likes, I just had a generally low acceptance rate for likes overall. Right, so I only got 2 people who really said anything about this, but it seems to just about be possible. So, conclusion from this, sorry, I'm kind of running over time maybe, but I'll keep going. So conclusions are, right, we seem to be getting slightly different subjects with the AEP and the similar standard embedded passive, right? It seems to be that we can more easily get these non-sentient subjects or idiomatic subjects or whatever with the AEP than with the standard embedded passive, with all of these verbs, with needs, wants, likes. So I think what this tells us is that the AEP is a raising construction, right? So in none of these cases, with none of these verbs, is the verb imposing a requirement on the subject. Right, the subject be something with volition. Right? And so this corresponds very nicely with the usage hierarchy. Right? So if we think about people who have the AEP, right, and they also have some awareness and some use of more standard forms. Right? So not necessarily the standard embedded passive, but other types of standard forms with embedded verbs, for instance, and with passives. Right? So what this means is that we know that need is consistently a raising verb anyway in standard English. Right? So if you're a speaker who has the AEP, it's going to be very easy for you to use need as a raising verb in the AEP. Right? Now, want is basically a control verb, but maybe we have some uses where it's more like a raising verb, where it's more like need. Right? So it might be a little bit harder if you're an AEP user to use want as a raising verb, right? So harder than using need, right? But you might still be able to do that. But that possibly shows why you are less likely to be able to do that, because there's more of a shift. And then when we get along to like, right, which is basically not a raising verb, right, we get even more of a shift. Right? If you're going to use it as a raising verb in the AEP, that's going to be a lot harder. That's going to be more different. Right? So it corresponds, our usage hierarchy, very nicely to the hierarchy of these verbs as whether they can be used as raising verbs. Okay. Right. Is that all okay? Yeah. Right. So fairly quickly, the other thing to consider with this is the participle. Right, so we have something like the wall was painted, right, where it's a passive, or it could be more like a linking verb and an adjective. Right, so this is ambiguous. Right, like there's a painted wall. That wall is painted. Right. When we test whether this participle in the AEP corresponds to more adjectival or more verbal uses, we get very strong indication that it's not adjectival. Right? So something like the letter needs written, right, is fine. If you put a well in there, it needs well written. Speakers say they really can't say this. Right? Usually, if we use something like written as an adjective, we would say a well-written letter as opposed to a written letter. And other types of modifications. So much, again, it doesn't work. This kind of right? So if we say the car needs unwashed, presumably that means somehow like undoing the washing. It's like it would have to be a verbal rather than an adjectival and we can't use non-participial adjectives. So we can't just say the car needs clean. So indication that this is really verbal. These other tests, so if we use some sort of adverbial modification, it needs washed very carefully, that's good, that indicates it's verbal. A by phrase, again, that's acceptable, indicates it's verbal. And in fact, this is in the title of the talk as well, right? If we have direct objects and indirect objects, we can passivize it both ways. So another indication is verbal. So we can say consideration needs given to other factors, or even other factors need given consideration, right? So we have pretty strong evidence that this participle is verbal. What this leads us to then is the conclusion that when we have our AEP, our main verb is directly selecting the participle, right? So I'll show you what I mean by this. But I already said, right, that cross-linguistically, right, control verbs tend to have bigger complements, right? So more structure after them than raising verbs. And we've said this is a raising construction. So I think that this is another indication, actually, that there's less structure in the AEP than the standard passive. So to illustrate that, if we have a sentence like, the wall needs to be painted, right? We can also have a sentence like, the wall needs to be blue, right? If we were taking the standard and we were just having phonological ellipsis, so we're not pronouncing that bit, right? We could get the wall needs painted. The problem with that is then we could also get the wall needs blue, right? Which we can't do. So if we could just drop the to be, we'd not only drop it in the AEP, we'd drop it in other places. Right, so a better explanation is that we just don't have that structure for the to be. Right? So it's not just we're not saying it, the structure is actually not there. Right? So we have our verb wants, right? Because we're very limited in terms of the verbs we can use in this. So basically need, want, and like. Right? And want is saying, okay, I'm going to have as my complement, I'm going to have next to me a verb phrase, right, of a particular type, right, which is this participle, wants bed, right? And then if we had an adjective here, right, so the girl wants happy, right, which we can't say, right, we can restrict that. We can say, well, that's not right, because we have our verb, right, and it's right next to this adjective, and it's not going to choose that kind of participle, or an adjective. It's not a participle, obviously. It's not going to choose that, right? So that is how we can rule out having these ones that are not possible, right? But we can still have our AEP. So conclusion there is that it's actually a smaller structure. It's not the same as the one where we're just not saying the word, but the syntax is invisibly somehow still there. So this is just an illustration of the same thing. Right, so we have this sort of reaching across and not pronouncing, and we're not doing that, right? Because in our syntax, all our words, they're kind of very short-sighted, right? So they can't sort of reach around other things in the syntax. They have to be local, right? So this is what we're getting. There's nothing invisible in between there. Right, so conclusions, remaining questions. So if I were to do further work on this, which I may or may not, I would like to know what the distribution is in the UK of the AEP. right? Because we had, again, those sort of 4 data points. So it would be interesting to see where it's used, whether in Scotland and Pittsburgh, for instance, it's actually the same thing, right? And also, we have these other sort of similar things, right? So the cat needs feeding, cat needs out is something you might also hear. So whether, how these things compare, right, in terms of the syntax, are these similar syntactically, and also in terms of geographic distribution, right? So where does the AEP stop going south, and the cat needs feeding concealed passive start? And I don't know exactly what the answer to that is. We also get some more general implications, I think. So a lot of study of dialect really focuses on phonological and lexical features. And it's tricky in certain respects to study syntax, because again, you have to go and ask people, right? And then they tell you things that are not true about, I don't say this because it's wrong, right? So that's something problematic, but I think it's worth doing. And this kind of work on dialect syntax, so sometimes this is called micro-variation, so variation within a language, can contribute to our knowledge of variation and also syntactic theory, right? So this AEP turns out to be comparable to things that we get in other languages as well. And also that you saw I did an internet survey, right? So actually I have never been to Pittsburgh. But I managed to contact these people. I got kind of a snowball sample, right, where I contacted a few people, and then they said, I'll get my friend to take it, right? So that was very helpful in contacting people and getting this information, right? Also, you saw all of my internet examples, right, that I found online. So we can use sort of standard corpora. A lot of the time, corpora don't necessarily have lots of examples of non-standard usage. So there are various problems with using Google as well, right? Which is you might get people who are not really people who use this thing, but are using it because they think it sounds good or it sounds cool. You have to check that people are native speakers as well when you Google things. But that's also something that's useful even in backing up certain assumptions. So if you get some information and then you can go and look and see if you can confirm that data that you have from actual people. So that's also something to think about from this. And there are my references. Thank you.
Well, in fact, I do have a question, because you used the soup like salt and you said it was wrong.
Yeah.
And I, as a non-native speaker, actually would quite comfortably use the soup like salt when, for example, explaining to somebody how to prepare a given dish. For example, this and this likes pepper, this and this likes whatever. Because in my case, for example, I had it at home in Polish as a construction to say that, for example, the pickles that my mom used to make like honey in them because of the way they are actually prepared.
Okay, native speakers,
I wouldn't say that.
can you say the soup like salt?
No.
Yeah.
You could, but I think it would be improper. I mean, I might say it, but I wouldn't be saying it in a sort of serious context. I think I might actually have used it, but I don't think I would sort of use it in any sort of formal context. I think it's deliberately using something.
It's slightly humorous.
Yeah.
So when I was talking about the examples of expletives, right, so I had there, another thing people do sometimes is with weather verbs. But that's a little bit kind of borderline, because so when you say it's raining, and you don't say the weather is raining, right? The it is not really a thing. But I have also heard people say things like it's trying to rain, right? So some kind of personification of the weather. So you can use that as a diagnostic as well, but you do hear people do that a bit as well. So sometimes maybe humorous effect, yeah.
We go to town on the weather though, so.
Yeah.
We don't understand it, so it's...
Yeah, so I mean maybe that's, people who live in Scotland feel they have to talk about the weather. And, yeah.
You have to love the weather to actually be here, right?
Yeah.
How long did this take you? studying this, how long did you spend on it?
The study. So I kind of did it twice. Right. So I initially did it. Right. I had those 6 people, and that was when I was not living in Scotland. Right. So that was why I only had 6 of them. Right. You'd think it would be easy for me to find Scottish people. So that when I did it originally, I think it took me about 6 months. I mean, it wasn't the only thing I was doing at the time. And then when I did the second survey, it probably took me about 2 weeks. Because I put together the survey, I got respondents very quickly. Right? So I contacted some people, and then lots of them said, "Oh, I'll pass it on to somebody I know who is also from Pittsburgh." Right? So that was very quick. I also had some preliminary conclusions about it. Right? So surveying the people from Pittsburgh was more about confirming kind of what I already knew. Right? So some of my conclusions changed very slightly, but yeah, the second time around it didn't take very long because I got the respondents quickly.
Out of curiosity, where were you when you got the Scottish? Because if you were on the continent of North America, then you got Scottish samples while in North America and North American samples while in Scotland. And that was
So I was in Canada when I got the Scottish people, and I was mostly corresponding with them by email, right? And this is where, and some of them were my relatives, and this is where I got some of them saying, I really try to speak properly, and and not to do this, and I really disapprove of the way people talk on the BBC, and whatever. So so it was not the most sensible way to go about it, but that was just kind of how it turned out. Right? Yes. Well.
Right. So you've shown towards the end that there are basically people who do this AEP.
Yeah.
When they do it, it's not just ellipsis of the to be, right?
Yeah.
So their version of the syntax tree
is different. It's smaller,
right?
yeah.
But those people can usually do both things, or at least the ones who say who comment on it, or the variability. So my question was, is that somehow kind of, have they sort of learned 2 different things and they switch between them? Rather than having learned one thing and then just it varies slightly. It's the same underlying thing, but it varies.
Yeah, so the first thing to say is lots of people can't do both, right? So sometimes, seems really surprising. You're making a face. Seems really surprising, right? If you're somebody who has heard both, who's aware of both. But some people, if you say, can you say the cat needs to be fed? Say, I wouldn't say that. There are too many words in that, right? Or it sounds formal, or it sounds wordy, or something. So there are people who can't do both. And the alternative, if you have people who can do both, is that they're essentially bidialectal, right? So that they have this dialect, which is, Pittsburgh dialect or Scottish English, and they also have the more standard form. So this again gets the idea of having the 2 forms, right? And they're possibly influencing each other, right? Because they are dialects of the same language, right? So you don't necessarily get as much separation as if you're bilingual. Does that answer your question? Yes.
That does, and in fact, there is a research, just generally because there's a research project at Glasgow taking place right at the moment called One Speaker, 2 Dialects, and it's based on people from Bucky, just around the coast from here. So that might be kind of relevant for what we've been listening to, because that's about an individual person who can switch between two different dialects.
Yeah. So there's a question about, which I think they're looking at, about, is being bidialectal the same as being bilingual, right? And it's not necessarily, shaking your head. Yeah, no, but it's is it somewhere in between being monolingual and bilingual? right? Which it might be. Well,
have you heard Bucky Scott's though? Because like seriously.
So yeah, it depends also on how distinct your different dialects are. If you have two dialects.
I think it was Barbara who was telling us last year about the studies in Bucky, and it was the kids would use both forms of standard English and the Bucky dialect, but 100% of the adults would use the Bucky ones. So I guess it's how you're taught as well, that you try to teach proper English.
Yeah. Yes.
First.
So with this AEP, some people have the perception that this is not proper English. Some people are not aware. Many people are not aware that there is anything non-standard or not normal or not widespread about this.
Terrible challenging your example.
Right. What else do you have a problem with?
Yeah, because you said the wall needs blue would be not right, and
Yeah.
again I would challenge that by saying, for example, if you are expecting a baby and you walk into a room which has white walls and you say the wall needs blue because you're expecting a boy, you wouldn't necessarily say the wall needs pink to actually make it a girl's room, but again you would say the wall needs blue because it's a boy's room and you're making, a boy's room for your future child.
But would you not say the wall needs to be blue?
If
Well,
you were
I
mixing
could
the
use-
paints, you might say it needs blue in the sense you need to add some blue to it.
Right. So then you're using blue as in a noun.
Yeah,
Essentially, it
that's
needs blue as in blue paint. But I don't think you can say it needs blue to mean it. I mean, native speakers can tell me whether you agree.
You can be quite flexible. You could make blue into a verb, couldn't you? Like it needs blued, or it needs. That's the closest I think.
Yeah.
The best sort of relation of blue being a verb is saying I'm blue today.
But then it's not for her. Sorry.
Again, if you're saying you're blue,
So it's
you're
an
not
adjective,
saying you
though.
are going to be blue, but again, you were saying that your mood kind of makes you feel, well, blue for a mood reference, but again, so
But then that's something different.
Yeah.
It's something different.
I would still fiercely combat that I could and would say that wall needs blue as in that wall needs to be blue.
Okay.
Well, that's just me.
Well, you
Perhaps I'm a
can you
little
can
bit
try that out and see if it spreads. Yeah. So the other thing with this is so I call it the AEP, the alternative embedded passive. Nobody else does. So I made that up, right? So because people call it like the Pittsburghese passive or Scott or whatever. So because I'm talking about different locations, I came up with this. So if you're talking to somebody and they use this, you can say, "Oh, you did an AEP," right? So I think we could get this to spread.
I've actually heard wall needs blue used. I can't tell you to save my life where and by whom,
Right.
but I have heard it used by speakers of English.
Right. Well,
I'm not
that's
one
something
of
new
those.
for me.
You need to record them. Or
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So if somebody says that to you, you whip out your tape recorder and say that again, right? And
To
they'll
be honest with you, I've seen it in movies even.
yeah, okay.
And I couldn't right now, I will probably just go home and start digging through a movie collection to show you that one scene where it's actually
Okay.
used.
Well, if you can find it, I would be interested to see that.
Thank you so much for doing this talk.
Shall we go to the pub?
That's the only reason you do this stuff.
Right. So I could go to the pub anytime I want.
Yeah, but you can't go to the pub anytime you want with all of them.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.